I'm talking about post-colonial theories and African American criticism together. They're not the same, but several of their issues overlap. So I'm going to start right now by talking about post-colonial issues, but it will be the case that the language comes up again when we move specifically toward African American literature. First, it's important to know that in especially the 19th century, England, Great Britain, had this worldwide empire. And much like the empire in Star Wars, they colonized everything. They went everywhere, they took raw materials, they restructured governments. But the other thing they did is sort of rewrite whatever indigenous culture lived there, rewrite their ideologies. So there was this hegemony, which was the British ideology that sort of became the worldview, the ideology that controlled everything. And it filtered down to change fundamentally the way indigenous cultures imagined themselves. When the British Empire started to fall, which is in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of these cultures started to write again about their own experiences as colonized peoples. And post-colonial theory looks at these things that are written and theorizes about the ways in which colonialism worked and how to read post-colonial texts. Okay, so at heart, post-colonialism defines anyone who's not, and I'm just going to keep using Britain as the example, anyone who's not in the British hegemony as alter. Alterity means that you are other. Other, not necessarily in the psychoanalytic sense, but other as in different from. We talked about this when we talked about gender, women as being different from just a regular human person. So indigenous peoples and cultures were suddenly different from the hegemonic ideologies that Great Britain brought with them. I'm going to walk through the chapter actually, so I make sure to get to the certain critics I want to talk about. And the first is, well, let me start out first by saying that post-colonial theories, as does New Historicism, as does feminist theory and queer theory, all of these draw on a variety of other theories. So psychoanalytic theory and Marxist theories being the primary ones. The first theorist, and we're going to read his work on whatever the next day is called Edward Said. And Said has this theory called Orientalism, and we don't use the word Oriental anymore because it suggests that something is strange and far away and different. It also suggests that all Eastern Asian cultures or Southeast Asian cultures are homogenous, that they all have the same characteristics. But he uses it particularly to illustrate that when English writers are writing about the Orient, which he's using sort of ironically, they're really writing about, they're creating this discourse that doesn't describe people in parts of Asia. What it describes is this idea of Asia. And that when people when colonized people, say particularly in India, start to write back against the empire, those cultures are writing about what is actually the case instead of what Western cultures might imagine to be the case. Homi Bhabha, whom we're not reading, talks about these issues in slightly different terms. he uses the word unhomeliness to mean that once you are in a culture that has been colonized, you're at home neither in the culture of the colonizer, nor at home in your own indigenous culture. That you're always experiencing a sort of double consciousness where you are living in two different cultures or subscribing or resisting different ideologies at the same time. A lot of this comes up in, say, America as well. If your family is not necessarily American, and then you go to school and you learn to be American, then you might have the same kind of double consciousness. And he's using unhomeliness as a way to describe this in post-colonialist terms. Okay. One of the things that the book points out on page 206 is that the colonized writer must create a new discourse by rejecting all the established transcendental signifieds created by the colonizers. This is a way in which post-structuralism has affected not just feminist and queer theories or Marxist theories, but also, or psychoanalytic theories, but also created this sort of space for post-colonialism. Okay. Post-colonial criticism has to do with subaltern cultures, and subaltern just means lower than. It's normally true that when we say subaltern, we're talking about colonized peoples or peoples who have been oppressed due to their geography or ethnicity, but not always. But when I say subaltern, that's what I'm meaning primarily. And again, a lot of these issues overlap with issues of African American theory or criticism, which is obviously specific to America and has mostly to do with the fact that white Americans kidnapped and enslaved huge numbers of people from Africa and totally destroyed any indigenous cultures, and then forced, even now, people who identify as African American to adopt what we might describe as a white culture in order to succeed, let's say. And the book spends a lot of time talking about the history of different writers who have sort of been celebrated in the history of African American criticism, but I'm going to focus more on the theory. So the first person I want to talk about is John Muhammad, who writes about how important it is that we read texts for their nomadic value, the complexities of the world the work reveals, which is to say, we want to read African American literature because it teaches us, just the discourse teaches us about the complexities of the world, the way in which African American discourses, literature, writing, art is extremely, has been dispossessed or is not complicated, obviously, it's complicated, but oppressed. And that's more important than its noetic value, which has to do with the subjective values. So not so much what one person thinks when he or she or they write a book, but what the whole discourse seems to suggest. The other writer that the book highlights and whom we're going to read on whatever another day is Henry Louis Gates Jr. And he talks about how important it is to read African American literature not just as African American literature, but as literature in its own right. And that it's not just the case that theory has to be for white people, but that African American literature is as important as literature written by white people and deserves the same kind of critical rigor. Which is to say that when we talk about African American literature, we need not just celebrate literature written by African American people, but we want to think about it in terms of whatever post-structuralist theories or formalist theories that we might apply to white literature. In other words, Black literature is as good as and can stand up to the same kind of rigor. Okay, these, that's not to say that they're exactly the same. And another thing Gates points out is that there is a sort of double voicedness in African American literature that might remind us of unhomeliness in Homi Bhabha's theory. But that double voicedness doesn't mean that the literary or the artistic or the discourses of African American peoples isn't as rewarding as that of white people. In other words, we don't read them just because they're written by African Americans. We read them because they're important, interesting, and good. Okay, so that's what we're doing in class on Wednesday. And that's it. I'll see you then.